It was early 1944, and the skies over Germany had become a crucible of fire. Every morning, the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force lifted off from English airfields, forming great combat boxes that stretched for miles. Their mission was simple in concept, yet catastrophic in cost: break the industrial backbone of the Third Reich through daylight precision bombing. But between the safety of England and the deadly heart of Germany lay a stretch of airspace the bomber crews came to fear above all else. They called it the Gap of Death. This was the point on every mission where the American escort fighters could go no farther. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, formidable machines in their own right, burned fuel at a rate that made deep penetration into Germany nearly impossible. As they reached the limits of their range, they had to turn back, leaving the bombers alone. When the escorts wheeled westward, the men inside the B-17s and B-24s knew exactly what came next. Waiting for them were the Jagdgeschwader, Germany's elite fighter wings, commanded by pilots with years of combat experience. These were not rookies. They were the veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and the Eastern Front, flyers who had survived thousands of sorties in a war that had already lasted longer than anyone had imagined. When the American escorts disappeared, these pilots rose in disciplined, coordinated waves, attacking with precision and ferocity. To them, slow and unprotected bombers were almost stationary targets. Losses began to mount at an unsustainable rate. Entire formations were torn apart within minutes. Crews who had flown together for months vanished in fire and smoke, leaving only empty spaces in the once solid boxes of silver aircraft. Intelligence analysts warned that the 8th Air Force was being bled white. If nothing changed, the daylight bombing campaign, one of the central pillars of Allied strategy, could collapse entirely. Inside planning rooms in Britain and the United States, a grim realization took hold. No matter how courageous the bomber crews were, and no matter how tightly they flew their formations, they could not survive against veteran German squadrons without continuous, long-range fighter cover. The Gap of Death had become the decisive battleground in the air war over Europe, and until a fighter could cross it and stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, the outcome of the campaign, and perhaps the air war itself, hung in the balance. When the Mustang first appeared, few could have imagined it would one day decide the air war over Europe. Early Allied evaluations were lukewarm at best, and German pilots who encountered the first versions dismissed it outright. Designed originally for the British as a low-altitude tactical aircraft, the early P-51 carried the Allison V1710 engine, a power plant that performed well near the ground but lost effectiveness rapidly at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, its climb rate dropped. At bomber altitudes, 25,000 to 30,000 feet, it became almost unusable for serious air combat. In 1942 and early 1943, the Mustang was relegated to reconnaissance and ground attack roles. While it excelled at both, these missions did little to impress fighter pilots who judged aircraft by their high-altitude combat potential. In Luftwaffe ready rooms, veteran aces snickered at the notion that this mud mover could ever challenge their Bf-109s or Fw-190s. Even within the U.S. Army Air Forces, the Mustang was seen as a niche design with limited strategic value. American engineers knew the airframe held promise. It was one of the most aerodynamically efficient fighters ever built, with a laminar flow wing that reduced drag and provided excellent range. Pilots praised its control response and visibility, yet none of these advantages mattered if the Mustang could not fight where the war was being lost. High above Germany, in the same deadly airspace the bombers had to cross. By late 1943, the situation had reached a crisis. 8th Air Force commanders were desperate for a fighter with the speed, climb rate, and altitude performance to challenge the Luftwaffe's finest. The Thunderbolt was tough, but short-legged. The Lightning could go farther but suffered reliability issues in cold European winters. What they needed was something that did not yet exist. The answer was hiding in plain sight. A sleek, underestimated airframe that seemed to have failed before it had even begun. To save the daylight bombing strategy, the Mustang would have to be transformed, not incrementally but fundamentally. And that transformation would come from a decision that bridged continents and industries, turning an overlooked design into one of the most successful fighters in aviation history. By the autumn of 1942, the limitations of the Allison-powered Mustang were painfully clear. It was fast at low altitude, agile, stable, and remarkably fuel-efficient, but none of these qualities solved the urgent crisis of the bomber offensive. What the Allies needed was a high-altitude escort fighter, one that could meet the Luftwaffe where its most experienced pilots operated between 25,000 and 30,000 feet. And at those heights, the early Mustang simply could not compete. Yet within British circles, especially at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, a bold idea took shape. Engineers working with Rolls-Royce had long speculated that the Mustang's superb airframe was being held back by its engine. They believed that if it could be paired with the same Rolls-Royce Merlin power plant that had carried Spitfires and Hurricanes through the Battle of Britain, the result might be transformative. The Merlin was renowned for its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, which maintained power at extreme altitudes. Where the Allison gasped for air, the Merlin thrived. The proposal was daring. Removing the Allison and installing the Merlin would require major re-engineering, recalculated weight distribution, redesigned cowling, altered coolant systems, and new engine mounts. It was not simply an engine swap. It was the creation of a new aircraft inside an existing skin. Still, the British pressed forward. In October 1942, the first experimental Mustangs, equipped with Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engines, took to the skies over England. Test pilots immediately sensed something extraordinary. The Mustang surged upward with a climb rate previously unimaginable for the type. Its high-altitude performance no longer collapsed. Instead, it improved with altitude. The aircraft reached speeds over 430 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles faster at bomber altitude than the Allison version. Acceleration, roll rate, and sustained turn capability all improved dramatically. The transformation reached the United States as well. Packard, an American company licensed to build the Merlin engine domestically, began producing a version known as the Packard V1650. North American Aviation quickly integrated it into a refined Mustang design, the P-51B and P-51C. The aircraft that emerged was unlike anything the 8th Air Force had flown before. Suddenly, there was a fighter that could climb with a Spitfire, outpace most German interceptors, and still fly the long distances required for deep penetration missions. Luftwaffe intelligence officers were quick to take notice. Reports began filtering in that a new Allied fighter was appearing at altitudes once dominated by German units. Pilots who had previously mocked the Mustang now returned with sobering accounts. This new version could engage them on equal terms, and in many cases outmatch them. Its speed allowed it to dictate combat. Its range meant it appeared in places no American fighter had been seen before. What made the Merlin Mustang truly revolutionary, however, was how it fit into the broader strategic picture. For the first time, U.S. commanders had a fighter that could accompany bombers not only to the German border, not only to the Ruhr, but all the way to Berlin itself. A new phrase began circulating among Allied planners: continuous escort. This was the key that had been missing since the beginning of the air war. Still, one problem remained. The Mustang's impressive performance meant nothing without the fuel to sustain it on the longest missions. Despite its aerodynamic efficiency, even the Merlin Mustang could not yet travel from England to Berlin, fight, and return home. Solving that final obstacle would determine whether the 8th Air Force could carry the bombing campaign deep into the Reich, or whether the gap of death would continue to consume entire bomber groups. The Merlin engine had given the Mustang the speed and altitude performance it needed, but the decisive question remained untouched: could it go the distance? The bombing offensive was not decided over the English Channel or the Low Countries. The critical battles unfolded hundreds of miles deeper over central Germany, the Ruhr, Leipzig, and finally Berlin itself. To break the Luftwaffe, the escorts had to be present not just at the start of the mission, but at the moment when the bombers were at their most vulnerable. This meant flying from England to Germany, conducting a full-scale engagement with enemy fighters, then returning home on a single tank of fuel. At first glance, this seemed impossible. By late 1943, engineers and air planners understood that range was more than a matter of fuel capacity. It was a delicate balance of aerodynamics, weight, engine efficiency, fuel distribution, and tactical doctrine. The Mustang's inherent aerodynamic cleanliness, its laminar flow wing, its low-drag fuselage, its efficient cooling system, made it an excellent starting point. But even with these advantages, the aircraft could not yet meet the extreme requirements of deep escort missions. The 8th Air Force needed not just a long-range fighter, but the longest-range single-engine fighter ever fielded in the war. The first major breakthrough came from pilot feedback. Mustang crews reported that the aircraft's internal fuel system, while well-designed, created an imbalance when the forward fuselage tank was full. The center of gravity shifted aft, making the aircraft unstable in turns and more vulnerable in combat. Yet that same tank was essential. It increased operational range significantly. Engineers responded by revising flight procedures. Pilots were required to burn the fuselage tank first, stabilizing the aircraft before entering contested airspace. This small change turned a potential flaw into a manageable characteristic. The second breakthrough addressed the external fuel supply. Earlier escort fighters had used drop tanks, but they were often heavy, drag-inducing, or made from scarce materials. A new solution emerged in the form of lightweight paper-based tanks, laminated cylinders that could be mass-produced quickly and discarded without concern for cost. These 75 and 108-gallon paper tanks drastically extended the Mustang's operational radius. Once empty, pilots jettisoned them, restoring full maneuverability before combat. Still, extending range alone was not enough. New tactics had to be developed. Instead of escorting bombers in rigid, close formations, Mustang units were encouraged to roam ahead and above the bomber streams. This fighter sweep doctrine allowed American pilots to intercept German units before they could form attacks. It was a dramatic departure from earlier thinking, but it matched the Mustang's strengths: speed, endurance, and high-altitude performance. By early 1944, data began to change. Mission debriefs showed bombers reaching their targets with more intact formations. Fighter groups reported increasing contact with German interceptors far from the bomber stream. Luftwaffe units, once confident in their ability to mass for coordinated strikes, now found Mustangs engaging them before they could assemble. The gap of death was narrowing, not through any single innovation, but through a combination of engineering refinements, tactical evolution, and the Mustang's unique aerodynamic potential. Then came the moment Allied commanders had been working toward, the first missions where the P-51 could escort the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was more than a symbolic achievement. It meant the Luftwaffe no longer had sanctuaries in the skies above the Reich. From that point onward, every German fighter unit, no matter how deep inside Germany it was stationed, could be reached by American escorts. Range, once the Mustang's greatest limitation, had become its most decisive advantage. And soon, this would be tested on the most ambitious bombing mission the 8th Air Force had ever attempted. On the morning of March 6, 1944, a cold wind swept across the airfields of eastern England. Long before sunrise, crews moved through the darkness preparing for what would become one of the most significant missions of the air war. The target was the heart of Nazi Germany, the capital itself. Until this moment, Berlin had remained largely beyond the reach of American daylight bombers, protected by sheer distance and the lethal gauntlet of Luftwaffe fighter bases that stretched across the Reich. But now, with the P-51 Mustang finally capable of continuous escort, the 8th Air Force was ready to challenge the Luftwaffe on its own terms. The scale of the mission was extraordinary. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s assembled into vast formations, climbing slowly into the dim morning light. Behind and above them, their guardians rose, the P-51B and P-51C Mustang groups, tasked with escorting the force from England to Berlin and back again. For the first time, bomber crews felt a cautious optimism. The Mustang's long range and high-altitude performance meant they would not fly into the heart of Germany alone. This was the moment many of them had been waiting for, a chance to strike at the center of the Nazi war machine with full fighter protection. Across Germany, air raid sirens wailed as radar stations detected the approaching columns. Luftwaffe commanders, believing no American fighter could escort bombers this far, initially assumed the formations were unsupported. Orders went out to intercept. Fighter bases scrambled everything they could, Belev 109s, FW-190s, and specialized high-altitude units. German aces prepared for what they thought would be another devastating attack on unescorted bombers. But when they climbed to altitude, preparing to dive into the bomber's stream, they saw something that stunned them. Sleek fighters with long legs and shimmering silver wings stretching across the sky. More than 200 P-51s were already in position, cruising above and alongside the bombers, waiting. Many Luftwaffe pilots had heard rumors of a new American escort fighter, but few had truly believed it until that moment. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin erased any doubt. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic. German fighter groups attempted to mass for coordinated attacks, but the Mustang units preempted them wherever possible. Fast, agile, and capable of matching the Germans at altitude, the P-51s repeatedly broke up formations before they could dive onto the bombers. Dogfights erupted from the outskirts of the city to the very center of Berlin's airspace. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. The skies above Germany had long been a refuge, a place where experienced pilots could engage bombers without fear of deep escort fighters. But now, that sanctuary had vanished. Veteran German aces later recalled the moment as a turning point. For the first time, they realized that the Americans had found a way to bring the fight deep into the Reich. At the altitude and distance where the Luftwaffe once felt invulnerable, the cost of the mission was still high. Berlin was defended by heavy flak and determined fighters. Bombers were lost, and Mustang pilots did not return. But the strategic implication was unmistakable. The 8th Air Force had proven that it could strike the German capital in daylight with full fighter escort, and the Luftwaffe, already strained by years of attrition, could not easily replace the aircraft and pilots it lost on that day. From that point forward, every German fighter unit understood that no matter how deep inside Germany they operated, the Mustangs could reach them. The air war had shifted irrevocably. The Berlin raid marked the moment when the Luftwaffe's strategic position began to collapse, not through a single battle, but through the realization that the Allies had finally gained true air superiority in the heart of the Reich. By mid-1944, the Mustang had already transformed the air war, but its evolution was not yet complete. The P-51B and C models had proven themselves as long-range escorts with exceptional high-altitude performance. Yet combat experience revealed areas for improvement: visibility, armament reliability, and pilot ergonomics. Engineers at North American Aviation took these lessons and created what many historians regard as the definitive Mustang, the P-51D. The most visible change was the bubble canopy. Earlier Mustangs used a framed canopy that restricted rearward vision, a serious disadvantage in high-speed, high-altitude combat, where a moment's delay in spotting an attacker could be fatal. The new teardrop canopy offered unobstructed visibility in all directions. Pilots could finally scan the sky with full situational awareness, an advantage German pilots noticed quickly. Veterans who had once relied on approaching from blind spots now found those angles covered. The Mustang's pilot, encased in a crystal-clear dome, gained a tactical edge before a single shot was fired. Armament was the next major improvement. Earlier models carried 4 950 caliber machine guns, powerful but prone to jamming under high-G maneuvers. The P-51D increased the number to 6 Browning M2 950 caliber guns, mounted in redesigned wings with improved feed systems. The result was a devastating combination of rate of fire, reliability, and ballistic stability. A well-timed burst from a Mustang could shred an engine block, snap a wing spar, or ignite a fuel tank at distances where most other fighters struggled to achieve effective hits. German pilots respected the accuracy and lethality of the Mustang's armament, especially during head-on or diving engagements where a split second determined survival. Yet the most sophisticated innovation was the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight. This gun sight predicted the enemy aircraft's future position based on its turn radius and relative movement. Instead of manually leading a target through guesswork, the pilot simply adjusted a control to match the enemy's wingspan, placed the reticle over the aircraft, and fired. In the deadly swirl of a dogfight, this transformed accuracy. Pilots reported that engagements once requiring long bursts now took only a tap of the trigger. The gun sight reduced the time spent aiming and increased the margin for error, factors that mattered deeply when fuel was limited and the skies were crowded with enemy fighters. With these innovations, the P-51D became what pilots described as the complete fighter. It was not the fastest aircraft of the war, nor the tightest turning, but it was the most balanced. It climbed well, dove superbly, rolled responsively, and maintained performance at the altitudes where the Luftwaffe operated. It offered long endurance, heavy firepower, and unmatched visibility. In combat, these qualities combined to make the Mustang a formidable predator, able to escort, intercept, sweep, defend, and pursue. It was during this period that German commanders openly acknowledged the Mustang's impact. Adolf Galland, one of the most respected Luftwaffe leaders, later remarked that the introduction of the long-range Mustang meant the war was lost in the air. This was not hyperbole. It was a reflection of the strategic shift unfolding across Europe. The Mustang had taken away the one advantage that German fighter units had retained since the early years of the war: the ability to choose when and where to engage. With the P-51D, the Allies now possessed a fighter capable of reaching any significant target in Germany, fighting the Luftwaffe on equal or superior terms, and returning home. It was not a single improvement, but the culmination of engineering, pilot experience, and strategic necessity. The perfect predator had arrived, and its presence would soon reshape the fate of the Luftwaffe itself. By the summer of 1944, the appearance of Mustangs deep inside the Reich had become a daily reality, and the Luftwaffe was facing pressures it could no longer absorb. For years, German fighter units had inflicted heavy losses on Allied bombers, relying on superior experience, coordinated tactics, and home field advantage. But the P-51 changed every variable of that equation. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, carefully refined since 1940, was now being dismantled piece by piece. At its core, German air defense depended on the ability to concentrate fighters rapidly at the most critical point of a bomber raid. Radar stations detected incoming formations and passed the information through a centralized command network. Fighter groups scrambled in waves, forming large attack units that struck the bombers in swift, brutal assaults. These massed attacks were the Luftwaffe's most effective method of inflicting damage, but they depended on time, coordination, and freedom of maneuver. The Mustang erased all three. Allied commanders no longer restricted their escorts to tight formations. With its long range and exceptional speed, the P-51 could sweep far ahead of the bombers, seeking out German fighters before they assembled into cohesive attack groups. Instead of reacting to the Luftwaffe, the Mustangs disrupted it. Pilots hunted takeoff paths, intercepted climbing formations, and attacked assembly points. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter over its own territory, was increasingly forced into defensive, fragmented engagements. Each confrontation further drained the German fighter arm. What the Luftwaffe lost was not only aircraft, which Germany still had the capacity to replace in 1944, but pilots. The training system was collapsing under the pressure of fuel shortages, bombed facilities, and shrinking flight hours. Young German airmen now entered combat with only a fraction of the experience once considered standard. Facing seasoned American escorts flying Mustangs, their odds of survival were low. Meanwhile, veteran Luftwaffe pilots, the backbone of Germany's air defense, were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Some units entered the spring of 1944 with dozens of battle-hardened aces. By autumn, many of these same squadrons had only a handful left. The high command grew desperate. Emergency measures followed: accelerated training, shortened courses, and deployments of partially trained pilots into the most dangerous sectors. None of it was enough. Mustang pilots in debriefings reported a marked shift. By mid-1944, more engagements ended with German fighters breaking off early, outnumbered or outmaneuvered. Escorts increasingly found themselves flying over eerily empty airfields, places once crowded with experienced interceptors that were now silent or abandoned. The steady attrition was not dramatic in any single battle, but its cumulative effect was devastating. The Luftwaffe's decline was compounded by the expanding Allied bombing campaign. Fuel refineries, synthetic oil plants, transportation hubs, and aircraft engine factories became priority targets. With the Mustangs guarding the bomber streams, the 8th Air Force struck these objectives repeatedly and effectively. Fuel shortages soon reached crisis levels. Fighter pilots received drastically reduced training hours. Operational units struggled to mount sorties. Even high-ranking commanders acknowledged that without fuel, no amount of bravery or skill could sustain the fight. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe remained a force in name, but its operational strength was a shadow of what it had been. Intercepting a bomber formation grew more difficult with each passing month. Mustang groups crossed Germany with increasing confidence, encountering fewer organized defenses and more isolated, desperate attempts to hold the line. The air war had turned irreversibly against the Reich. In strategic terms, the Mustang did not defeat the Luftwaffe alone, but it made possible the sustained bombing campaign that did. It closed the gap of death, shattered the defensive shield around Germany, and forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it could not win. By giving the Allies control of the skies, the Mustang ensured that Germany's factories, supply lines, and oil production could be struck repeatedly and relentlessly. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was not a sudden event. It was a steady, grinding erosion accelerated at every stage by the presence of a fighter that could reach any point in Germany and return home. The Mustang had fulfilled its mission, but its story did not end there. Its legacy would extend far beyond the war itself, defined not only by its combat record, but by the profound shift it brought to the balance of air power. When the Second World War drew to a close in 1945, the P-51 Mustang stood as one of the most consequential aircraft of the conflict. Its journey, from an overlooked low-altitude tactical fighter to a long-range escort that reshaped the strategic air war, was unmatched in aviation history. But its legacy extended far beyond the dramatic battles over Germany. The Mustang became a symbol of what engineering, adaptation, and strategic necessity could achieve when aligned with determination and urgency. By the war's end, Mustangs had escorted thousands of bomber missions, flown deep strike sweeps across Europe, and engaged in countless dogfights with some of the most experienced fighter pilots of the era. They operated from England, Italy, and later from airfields deep inside the liberated territories, ensuring constant pressure on the retreating German forces. The aircraft's endurance allowed it to remain in the fight longer than almost any other single-engine fighter, providing continuous coverage over a battlefield that spanned an entire continent. But numbers alone do not capture its impact. The Mustang influenced the strategic direction of the war in ways few aircraft ever have. By enabling the Allies to carry out sustained bombing operations deep into the Reich, it contributed directly to the destruction of Germany's industrial base. It allowed the targeting of oil refineries, transportation networks, ball-bearing plants, and synthetic fuel facilities, sites whose loss crippled the German war effort. These campaigns, once too dangerous to attempt without long-range escort, became routine with Mustangs in the sky. The psychological effect on both sides was equally profound. Bomber crews, who had once faced the terrifying isolation of flying unprotected through enemy territory, now saw the distinctive silhouette of the Mustang beside them, even at the farthest edge of their missions. That presence boosted morale in ways that statistics could never measure. On the German side, the appearance of Mustangs over cities once considered safe, Berlin, Munich, Leipzig, Vienna, offered a stark reminder that the air war had fundamentally shifted. The Luftwaffe could no longer dictate the terms of engagement, and its pilots faced a relentless opponent who could chase them into their own airspace. After the war, the Mustang continued to serve in numerous air forces around the world. It flew in reconnaissance roles, ground attack missions, and air defense duties from Europe to Asia. Its most famous post-war performance came during the Korean War, where the P-51 proved once again that its design possessed enduring relevance. Though jet fighters were beginning to dominate the skies, the Mustang still excelled in low-altitude support missions, making use of its stability, range, and weapons carriage in ways that newer aircraft could not easily match. Beyond its operational history, the Mustang left a lasting imprint on aviation engineering. Its laminar flow wing, once a daring innovation, became a point of study for aircraft designers worldwide. Its integration of high-performance airframe with a two-stage supercharged engine demonstrated the transformative effect of matching aerodynamic potential with the right power plant. The lessons learned from its development influenced future generations of fighters, from post-war piston designs to early jets. Today, the P-51 Mustang remains one of the most recognized and celebrated aircraft in history. Restored examples appear at air shows, museums, and commemorative events across the world. The deep, distinctive growl of its Merlin engine, an unmistakable sound even decades later, continues to remind listeners of the era in which air power helped decide the fate of nations. Its legacy is not merely mechanical or tactical. It represents the convergence of global cooperation, engineering innovation, and the raw urgency of wartime necessity. The Mustang story embodies the idea that a single, well-designed aircraft can alter the trajectory of a campaign, and more importantly, it stands as a testament to the countless pilots, engineers, mechanics, and crews whose efforts transformed a once-dismissed fighter into one of the defining symbols of Allied air superiority. The P-51 began as a misunderstood machine, doubted by friend and foe alike, but history remembers what the skies over Europe ultimately revealed. The Mustang was not only one of the most effective fighters of the Second World War, it was one of the most influential aircraft ever built.